I have the honor of introducing this afternoon's program. However, I want to say a few paid political announcements first. You have a survey in your chairs, and it would help us very much if you would fill it out. I also want to thank our sponsors. We have a lot of sponsors for this event. Thanks you so much, but in particular, John and Jeannie Mangum sponsored this event today. And without them, raise your hands. Without them, this would not have been possible, so thank you so much. So, I was telling our upcoming guest that I kind of wing it because I've had to introduce him so many times, but it's been such a pleasure to work with Joe M. Turner. He's performed in New York and Atlanta and all over the world, and he has contributed his expertise to our Houdini exhibition. It's been unbelievable working with him. He's fabulous. He's Atlanta-based, but he's been at corporate events and theater events all over the world, as I said, and he has produced numerous magical events and shows, some of which he'll be doing for us in a few weeks. In addition to his own speaking engagements and performances, because he uses magic as an entree into lots of corporate events, and he did a bar mitzvah last night. He's also our programming partner for Inescapable, so he'll tell you more about who you're about to meet. So please welcome Joe Turner.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Atlanta Magic community, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here. You've already heard about the amazing magical programming that is happening as part of the Inescapable exhibition throughout the summer. So please make plans to come back on Sunday afternoons from now through August, and you'll find amazing lectures and performances and opportunities to really find out what makes magic happen here in the city of Atlanta. It has been a real honor to work with the Breman Museum on their programming. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to a man I've known for about 20 years, a fantastic magician, author, entrepreneur. I could go on and on, but I'll just narrow it down to a few short things. First of all, he has got a show running in New York called 6 Impossible Things. I'd encourage you to go see it, but good luck getting a ticket because it's sold out. This man has fooled Penn and Teller. He's one of that elite club. And you might have even seen him on The Tonight Show recently. Please welcome my friend Joshua J.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you so much. Hello. Welcome. We're going to start this unusual afternoon with a card trick. And it's not going to be the most involved card trick you've ever seen. In fact, this will be a card trick that for the many magicians who are here from the local magic scene, they probably know it or do some version of it. But what I can promise you is that by the end of this talk, you're going to see this card trick in a very different way. So it starts very simple, like this. Sir in the front row on the corner, say stop anytime. Right there, a little more, a little less, you happy? Remember this card. I'm going to cut your card back into the deck. A quick shuffle. And now, you will find his card. Would you stand, please? Touch any card. Just touch. This one right here. Ladies and gentlemen, the 3 of spades. Notice I didn't say that was his card, I just said that's the 3 of spades. You better sit down. It appears we've made a mistake. You picked the 3 of spades, but that's not your card, right? You all saw his card. What was his card? You can say. 9 of hearts, okay. You actually did just fine. It just takes a moment to find the 9 of hearts. This is a trick called wrong card, right card. It's a simple magic trick. It's kind of like a standard that magicians riff on and do different things. I've got a few different versions. This is the simplest one. This trick was shown to Werner Reich at Auschwitz. His bunkmate did this trick for him and then taught him this trick, which instilled in him a love of magic that he has to this day. So right now, without further ado, we're going to get into this love of magic, this unusual place that he found magic, and the incredible life of Werner Reich. Right over here. All right, look at this. Look at this. Wow.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. So we want to talk about a lot of things, but when we've shared the stage before, it's been a great honor. And one thing I notice is that the real power of having Werner here is you guys getting to ask questions. It's not every day you get to talk to somebody who's lived through so much and experienced so much. So we're going to limit the interview to about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to many questions, which I hope you will ask. So we're going to get to the magic, but let's start at the beginning. Tell us where you were born, early life.
Early life. I was born in Berlin, Germany. My father was a mechanical and an electrical engineer, and we lived a typical middle-class Jewish life in Germany. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, a couple of things happened. Number one, a law was instituted that Jews couldn't work for major corporations, colleges, and hospitals. And the other problem was that there came a law of overcrowding of schools, which meant that the principals of the schools could decide who could go to school and who couldn't. And obviously Jews were cut out. And so in 1933, my father didn't have a job anymore, and my sister and I, we couldn't go to school. So we left Germany and we went to Yugoslavia. The reason why we went to Yugoslavia was my father was an officer during World War I in the Austro-Hungarian army, and he had spent some time in Yugoslavia, so he thought it would be a great place to go to. And at that time, 1933, everybody thought, in 2 years Hitler will be over and we'll return back home. Obviously, everybody was wrong. And we had to sell our house for next to nothing. And when we left the country, about 25% of all of our financial means were confiscated by the government as I think, emigration tax or something like that. In any case, we came to Yugoslavia, and my father couldn't find a job because Yugoslavia was strictly agricultural. At that time, just to give you an idea, the country was something like 75% illiterate. They were having huge natural resources, but they were all exported to Germany or to some other countries where they were refabricated and then imported to Yugoslavia.
Werner, did your parents tell you why you were leaving Germany? Did you sense what the problems were, or were you, because you were born in 27?
Yes.
And this is 33, so you were young.
I was 6 years old. No, my parents didn't communicate, didn't tell me why we left Germany. My parents were typical Victorians, and they believed in the theory that children are to be seen and not heard. I didn't know, for instance, what a concentration camp was until I found myself in one. So I didn't know that my parents had financial problems in Yugoslavia. I didn't know why we left Germany. My father suffered from a kidney disease. I wasn't even advised of that. I only found out many years later from my sister, maybe 30, 40 years later, why the causes of my father's death.
Okay, so now you find yourself in Yugoslavia,
Yeah.
and things take a turn for the worse.
No, things were very nice for me.
Okay.
I was a kid. I was very happy. I went to schools. I learned Croat, and I learned Serbian writing, and I was happy. I didn't know the problems that my parents had. And then in 1940, I never experienced any anti-Semitism whatsoever. And in 1940, my father died. And then a few months later, Germany invaded Yugoslavia.
And that's when everything changed.
Everything got turned upside down.
So I want to take a quick pause, because one thing you've said to me that I find, particularly galling is, talk about your mother, because she was a proud German.
My mother was an extremely proud German. She was a typical German Jew. German Jews were proud of Germany. They were fighting during World War I. My mother was in the German army, and so was her brother. Just to give you an idea how proud the German Jews were, in 1914 there were roughly 0.75% of Germany was Jewish, 0.75%. Yet the German military had 3% of Jews. So in other words, 4 times the anticipated number of Jews signed up for the military. My mother fought on the Eastern Front. She was a nurse on the Eastern Front, and she saved the lives of a whole bunch of German soldiers. And as a result of that, she was awarded the Iron Cross with a citation that the gratitude of the fatherland will be with you forever. And she believed it. She actually believed it. And in addition to this, her father fought in the war in the United States and in the Civil War, and he obtained American citizenship. So my mother was a German. She was a Iron Cross winner, and she was also an American citizen. So she felt 100% safe. Nothing will ever happen to her.
So then what happened when Germany, when Hitler came to power? You're in Yugoslavia, and your father's dead, and your mother has to make a choice. Tell us about that.
Well, at that point, Germany invaded Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia, which many of you may know, was really no country until 1918, when it was assembled from 6 countries: Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Montenegro. And these countries were put together into one country called Yugoslavia. And in 1941, when Germany invaded Yugoslavia, the country fell apart. Now, and not only that the country fell apart, but various countries were fighting each other. The Serbs were fighting the Bosnians and the Croats. The Croats were fighting the Serbs. And so there was a constant internal warfare going on. the Serbs were fighting the Germans, but the Croats were very much pro-German, and they instituted a man called Dr. Ante Pavelic to be the head of the government in Croatia, and he was a Nazi of the worst kind. He immediately opened a concentration camp, and sorry, I don't want to use the word concentration camp, extermination camp. Jasenovac, there were 6 extermination camps that Germany had, and they were all in Poland, and the 7th was Jasenovac. And in Jasenovac, about 200,000 people were murdered. Of them, roughly 20,000 were Jews.
So your mother decided to do something with you and your sister.
My mother felt safe. She knew that being an American and being an Iron Cross bearer, she was safe. But the children were not. So I had a 4-year-old sister, who was 4 years older than me. And she placed my sister with one couple, and she placed me with another couple who worked for the resistance movement, which was sort of a rather stupid idea, placing me with somebody who is being eagerly searched for by the German secret police. Anyway, it's like hiding the cheese in a mousetrap.
And what was life like living with this partisan family?
Life was extremely lonely, because, first of all, they were adults. I was 13 at that time, and at that time, as I pointed out, children and adults did not really mix. That was the time when many children called their father sir and their mother madam, and I had absolutely no relationship with that couple. I cooked, I cleaned, and most of the time I spent in the bathroom developing films and making enlargements for the resistance movement. I had no contact with any of my friends. Whenever I called them up on the phone, there was somebody else on the phone whose voice I didn't recognize. By this time, most of them were already dead.
So what happens? What's the next chapter?
The next chapter was that I lived there for 2 years, and one morning there was a knock at the door, and 4 or 5 Gestapo agents came in. Gestapo is the Geheime Staatspolizei, which is German secret police. And they walked in and they took everything out of the closets and threw it on the floor. There was a guy standing there. I was lying, sleeping on a couch in the living room, and he was standing with a gun over me. It's the first time in my life I've ever seen a gun, particularly pointed at me. And then at one point I wanted to go to the bathroom, and he ordered me to keep the door open, and he stood there with a gun.
13.
It's not a pleasant feeling to communicate with nature having a gun at your back. Anyway, it speeds up. Never mind.
So you were taken away, and you were taken to Graz, right?
They arrested me and they took me down to their headquarters, and then I was taken to a room, and there was a small, stocky Gestapo agent there, and he kept asking me questions, and I was playing a big hero. First of all, I didn't know anything anyway, where these people got the films from, but in any case, I felt And I felt this throughout the first maybe 6 months of my imprisonment. I was innocent. I didn't commit any crime, so nobody can do anything to me. And the guy questioned me, and it made no difference what answer I gave him. He always hit me. And I was bleeding and crying all over his carpet, and that went on for a few hours.
You were 13.
I was 13.
Beating up a 13-year-old. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean, his mother must have been very proud of him anyway. So.
And I like this detail. They stuck you in a holding cell with several other people, right?
No.
Oh, that's later.
That came later. No.
Oh, okay.
And then I was locked up in a basement in a cell that must have been a coal cellar before. There was nothing in it, which was concrete floor, and there was a bucket there to be used as a toilet. And I was there for 3 days, and I lived on liverwurst sandwiches for 3 days. And they obviously lacked imagination as far as food is concerned. And after 3 days, I was shipped to a border town between Croatia and Slovenia. And there I was locked up in a little wooden shed, which must have been a drunk tank or so, which was filled with fleas, millions of them. It was springtime. I had short-sleeved shirt and short pants, and these fleas, they just attacked me, and it was unadulterated hell. After 3 days, I was shipped. A Gestapo agent came, and we went by train from Slovenia to Graz, Austria. And we arrived at the railroad station, and there was a big police truck, and with the bars on the window, and they took me to a jail in Graz, and to the main police station. And there I was locked up in a little cell with 3 other kids. They were not Jewish. 2 of them had been arrested for burglary, and the 3rd kid had murdered his mother. And I was the 4th criminal there. And that's where I had my only revenge on the German government, because I infected that cell and the adjacent cell with fleas. But that's about the total extent of my revenge.
So you're in this cell with somebody who murdered their mother.
Yeah.
And 2 kids convicted of burglary.
Yes, but I was still low man on a totem pole because I was Jewish, and they were not. So, I mean, they had a chance of coming out alive, I didn't. But I didn't know any of that. I didn't have the slightest idea. I was totally naive. I was there for 6 weeks. And then one day I looked out of the prison window into the yard, and I saw my mother walking around in a circle, and that's the last time I saw her. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Jerusalem, and I went to Yad Vashem, and I spent 2 hours with them and searching and researching. I had 2 jobs to do. One of them is they had me listed as dead. My wife claimed it for years, but anyway, I had to prove to them that I was alive, and they gave me lots of information about me, and they didn't have any more information about my mother. The only thing they had was that I reported that she was in Graz. That's the last thing.
So you saw your mother from the prison cell window.
Yes.
Were you able to shout to her, or?
No. There were the bars. The bars were inside the cell, and then maybe, I don't know what, 6-8 inches further, there was the glass.
Horrible.
And then, so you couldn't.
Okay. And then
And
tell us.
I was up on the on the third floor, which was equivalent to a five-story tall building, because the other two floors were had high ceilings.
Okay. So keep going. Tell us what happened after this holding cell that you were in.
After this holding cell, I was there for, as I said, 6 weeks. I was taken by police car to Vienna, the city of my dreams. And I was locked up during the night in a beautiful synagogue that had been destroyed during the night of the broken glass. There was soot and dirt, and there were torn prayer books, and there were about 120 other people there. And from there, the next morning, we were put into railroad cars and went on a 2-day train ride to Theresienstadt, which was in Czechoslovakia. Theresienstadt, or as it's known in Czech, is a old fortress. Actually, there were two fortresses, one large fortress on one side of the river and a small fortress on the other side of the river. And on the other side, there was a prison. And for those of you who are history aficionados, that's where Gavrilo Princip, the man who murdered Prince Ferdinand II, who started World War I, was locked up, and where he also died. Anyway, Theresienstadt was, as I said, a fortress. And when planes were invented, fortresses became useless, because all you do is you fly over them and drop a couple of bombs. So the civilians moved out, and about 3,000, the military moved out, and about 3,000 civilians moved in. And then Hitler had, or the German government had a brilliant idea. The Swiss authorities and the Swedish authorities and the Red Cross accused the Germans of mistreating Jews, and they were not permitted to do that. That's a no-no. They were supposed to be treated like prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, and the Germans had to convince the various authorities that they are really nice guys and don't hurt the Jews. So they transformed Theresienstadt into a demonstration city for the SS, for the Germans. Jews wore regular clothing. We had to wear yellow star, and they gave them musical instruments. They sent in the intelligentsia of Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia to Theresienstadt. So they gave him pencils and paper, and the children were educated in schools, and everything looked hunky-dory. There were only two major problems. The first problem was that the food was lousy. It was typical concentration camp slop. So if there was an inspection, they had to do something about that. So that was easy to cure. All you had to do is you just improve the food. You just bring in better food for the day than when the inspection is there. But there was another problem. You had before 3,000 people lived there, and suddenly there were around about 60,000. And that means 20 times more people than before. So what do you do with these people? Well, the solution was very easy. All you do is you pack them into railroad cars, and you ship them to Auschwitz, to the gas chambers, and you kill them. And that's what they did. And as a result of that, in Theresienstadt, 141,000 people had been shipped to Theresienstadt, and 17,000 survived. That's it.
So one thing that I'm just so curious about when I hear you tell this story is I can't get over that you went through all of this alone. I mean, so many Holocaust stories that I hear and that I read about, at least for part of the journey they go through with some family, but you were alone this whole time. Can you talk a little bit about whether you were lonely, or did you make friends, or did you kind of go in with another family, or how did that work?
I made friends, and I was sort of convinced that all of this is going to stop very soon. First of all, I didn't know anything about the death camps or anything that happened after Theresienstadt. And I was totally naive about what was going on. I had no idea what a true concentration camp was. I had no idea that the word death even entered into the formula. So I made friends like a typical teenager. I spoke German, so many of the, obviously I could communicate with the German and the Austrian kids there. I could not communicate with the Czech kids because they spoke Czech. Mm-hmm. But I was, in daytime, I was never lonely. It was at night.
At night?
At night, yeah.
Of course. So what happens next? You're at this show camp.
Next, there was obviously another, how do you call it? I worked there, by the way. I laid railroad tracks, I exterminated vermin, I made big baskets for carrying potatoes. I did all different types of work. And then after 10 months, there was obviously another inspection coming, and I was surplus goods, and they took us, about 2,500 of us, and they put us into 25 railroad cars, 100 people per car. They gave us a piece of bread and a couple of cans of sardines, which the Red Cross must have sent. And we were given that and put into railroad cars, cattle cars. And they put in a bucket and closed the doors, windows, and off we went on a 3-day ride. And obviously the buckets overflowed after an hour, and for 3 days we were lying in our feces and in our urine. And then after 3 days the doors opened, and we were faced by a group of SS-men and people in striped uniforms. And every one of them had a walking stick. And they were hitting us over the faces, wherever they could. People were lying and bleeding on the floor. It was a scene out of hell. So we asked, where are we? And they told us, you were in Auschwitz, Birkenau. Never heard of it. And we were then stripped of everything that we had. We were tattooed, got a tattoo on our arms, and then we were given striped uniforms.
So I want to just take a pause for some of the younger people watching. Is it easy for you to roll your sleeve back?
Yeah.
Can you see it? And tell us about this number and how that worked. It says A, what does that say?
A1828. And by the way, when I was on my honeymoon in Paris, I bought a lottery ticket with that number, and it lost. What the hell did you expect, winning? No, you stood in line. It's a sort of it was a traumatic, very short experience. We arrived, we were stripped naked, and we were standing there, and there were guys sitting on chairs, and they had razors, and they shaved your pubic hair, and they smeared it with some extremely burning liquid, I think Lysol or something like that. The Nazis were terrified of lice. They were absolutely maniac about it. And then they cut all our hair off. Then there were two guys sitting there. One had a piece of paper, cards or something. They asked you a couple of questions. The next guy grabbed your arm and took a needle, tattooed it. Next. And the whole thing lasted maybe a minute. Then that was it, finished.
So Werner, at this point, you spoke a moment ago about saying, well, we didn't know what was going to happen next. I was an optimist. I was naive. At this point, 3 days in a cattle car, you get off and you see Auschwitz. Are you starting to think differently now? Is this it? No. Still optimistic.
Still optimist. I mean, it's, the only deaths I've encountered were a couple of people who had died in my car when we traveled there. But no, it's still, things will straighten out. It was. I wasn't threatened in any form. I was beaten, but certainly not, except for the guy standing over me while I was sitting on the toilet, in Zagreb, but with a gun. But beyond that, no, I was naive. I believed nothing is going to happen. And then we got into the camp, and there were people who had been sent from Theresienstadt before, and they told us, hey, you'll be here. Did you sign a card that you'll be here for 6 months as a security? And I said, yeah, we signed it. So I said, well, in 6 months you'll leave the camp through the chimney. And he said, what? So I said, you leave the camp through the chimney. I said, well, what does that mean? So you'll see. And that was that. And then we thought it was a stupid joke. And it took me about 2 weeks until it actually sank in. Because the camps were separated by barbed wire, so you could see a mile. There was nothing to stop you. And the crematoria were not too far from us, maybe 1,000 feet or something like that. And we saw people walking in, and we smelled the smell, and we heard people crying, but it didn't add up. But then suddenly we understood what was happening, and we felt like rats in a trap. There was no place where you can go. And it was an absolutely horrible feeling, because you couldn't communicate with the other people who were exactly in the same boat. And in daytime you spoke, but at night when you were lying in the barracks, that's when you were terribly, terribly lonely. And it was... Then we started seeing people committing suicide. They threw themselves against the wire. They were all people in their mid-late 30s, people who lost their families, lost their business. There was no reason for them to exist. Yeah.
Talk about the barracks a little more. You talked about you wanted to be high in the barracks instead of low.
Yeah. One of the reasons, first of all, the bunks were on 3 levels. And the lowest bunks were taken usually by very, very strong guys or very weak guys. Strong guys liked it because they could sit down and just lie down, and that was it. And the weak guys, they couldn't climb up. So the middle level was at a disadvantage because you had to crawl, and you banged your head against the boards of the upper. But the upper one, if you had the energy and the strength, was nice because, number one, no urine and no feces dribbled on you as they were in the others. And secondly, you could raise your head. So that's the reason why I chose the upper one.
All right, so now you had an interesting meeting in the barracks.
Yes.
Tell us about this chance encounter.
I was, when I got into we were assigned the barracks, and I climbed up on the top barrack. I didn't know all the other things that were happening, but I sort of, I don't know, I just liked the idea of being up on top. So I climbed up on top, and I laid second from the edge. There were 6 people there, 3 lying in one direction and 3 lying in the other direction. There was a guy laying next to the edge, then I was in the middle, and then there was another guy next to me. And the guy next to me, the one next to the edge, he was a man in his, at that time, he was about 34 years old. And he was very friendly, and he introduced himself as Herr Levine. And he was an adult. Obviously, I was a kid. I was 16 at that time. And I was, I was glad that he even spoke to me. And he sort of inquired about me a little bit. All I knew is that he was born in, that he came from Germany, and obviously he had been in Terezin because he came on the same transport as I did. And one day I had been assigned to some work assignment and in the camp, and I came back, and there was Herr Levine sitting there with a deck of cards. And seeing somebody in the camp with a deck of cards is like finding a gorilla in your bathroom. I mean, there's absolutely, you can't comprehend where it came from, what it was doing there, or anything of the sort. And then he proceeded to show me a card trick, which was already knocked my socks off, although I didn't have any. And he then immediately explained it to me. He didn't wait for me to ask him, but he immediately explained it to me. And I remembered his words. I remembered every detail. It was the first trick I've ever seen in my life. I've never seen a magician before. I've never seen a card trick. I've seen some very primitive card tricks before, but this one was unbelievable. And from that point on, I practiced that card trick every single day in my head. And from Auschwitz, I went Do you want me to continue?
Yeah,
Okay.
I do, but just let's pause for a
Yes,
moment and talk
yeah.
about this magician.
Yes.
So his name was Levine, but
Herbert Levine.
Herbert
That-
Levine, but
yes.
his stage name was Nivelli, which is Levine backwards with just like Houdini, Slidini with the, Nivelli, right? So you add that to it. So remarkably, I mean, just to sort of pause and let you know, magicians don't explain their tricks after they do it, but something about this man in that circumstance, giving hope to the people around him, to his bunkmate Werner, he teaches this trick. And even a simple trick like the one he taught, the one that you saw, it's not simple in layman's terms. I mean, this isn't something you practice in your head, but it is remarkable that you were able to keep the method, the inner workings, the subtle differences, the way that the hands have to move in accordance with what you're saying. I mean, even simple magic tricks are very complicated. And he kept it all in his head and was able to do it after he was liberated. I mean, that's extraordinary.
I remembered, I think the most important thing is, I remembered the rhythm, the movement, I remembered the flow of the trick. And that's what actually, that's the thing that I did remember.
So let's, before we continue with the rest of your story, talk a little bit about how you have stayed in magic and mentalism even today.
About a year and a half, maybe 3 years later, I found myself in London, and I went and I bought myself a deck of cards, and for the first time in 3 years, I actually performed the trick. I performed it for myself. And it worked. I mean, I couldn't believe it. It actually worked. And I showed it to some friends of mine, and they were amazed. And then I discovered a magic store in London, and I bought some magic tricks. And I amazed my friends with them, and then I bought some magic books. And, they say there's a very thin line between a hobby and insanity. And
even to this day, you're a member of the International Brotherhood of Magicians.
I became a member of the International Brotherhood of Magicians. I'm a member of the Psychic Entertainers Association. I have a fairly large library at home, and I love magic. But most importantly, what came out of it is I developed a certain stage presence. And that stage presence permits me today to go to schools, and I speak close to 100 times a year in schools, to go to schools and talk about the Holocaust and fight anti-Semitism and fight bias. And that's probably...
Okay. So we'll come back to magic in a moment. That's of course why we're all here in conjunction with this Houdini exhibition, but we need to go back to the story. So, you're in Auschwitz. How long did you stay there?
I stayed in Auschwitz, I came in May. On July 6th, I went through 3 selections by Dr. Mengele, where he sorted out 89 of us out of a lot of 5,000. And the 89 of us, we were sent to another camp, and the other 5,000 over the next 5 days were sent to the gas chambers.
How close were you to Dr. Mengele?
I saw him every day. He was walking through the camp every day. So, I tried to stay away from him. And,
And when you say you were sorted, did you have to run in front of him?
No, we were running. We were stripped naked, and we ran for our lives. We tried to look taller and stronger and healthier. happier, anything that will make you look better than you. We were scarecrows, we were skinny, we lived on 400 calories of food a day. And many of us had diarrhea, and we were just skeletons. And yet we were trying our best to survive. It was a question of life or death.
Yeah. And so 89 of you were selected and sent away to where?
We were sent to an adjacent camp to the penalty division of the camp, and I was sent from there to Auschwitz I, where all the criminals were, the one which has the big sign which says Arbeit macht frei. And that's where I worked in the stables. I fed the horses, I brushed them, and I also stole some of their food because they were feeding them dried sugar beets, so I could supplement my meager diet with some sugar beets.
Whatever you have.
Listen, if you're hungry, as long as it doesn't move, you eat it, you know. I mean, it's. So I was there till January 1945, and in January 1945, all the criminals, all the coppers, were put in German uniforms and sent to the Russian front because the Russians were advancing. And 60,000 of us, we went on a 3-day death march. And
to Mauthausen?
We went from Mauthausen to some Polish village 35 miles away. And it was winter, ice, snow, and the only water we had was snow and ice, and we had no food. And of the 60,000, 15,000 died during that march. And the rest of us, we were loaded into open railroad cars, and we traveled for 4 days, and we ended up in Mauthausen. And maybe over half the people died on that trip. And when we came to Mauthausen, which was a concentration camp from hell, we were showered and we collapsed because all of us were frostbitten, and my feet started to rot. And there was a Serbian doctor, he cut off my toes on one foot and part of the toes on the other foot. And that's how he saved my life. Then things got really bad because we were squeezed between Russian forces and American forces, and there was no food there.
But when they cut off your toes, there were no bandages, right?
No, there was just paper. He just had paper.
And did you ask for this? Did you go to somebody and say, hey, my feet are starting to turn color?
No, when I arrived, I collapsed. I was swearing very loudly in Croat. And in that camp, there were lots of Serbian prisoners of war. And obviously they spoke Croat, so they understood and they knew he is one of our boys. And
he took pity on you and he helped you.
And
but then you can't walk when they cut part of your toes off for a few days, right?
Pardon?
You couldn't walk.
No. By this time, what happened was all the SS were taken into the military, and the camps were closed. Very, very little food entered. Mauthausen was a fortress. Again, was built like a fortress. So they starved us to death. There were thousands upon thousands of dead bodies. We ended up getting a tablespoon of moldy bread a day. I slept next to a dead man for 3 days just to get his ration. So I was about this close to dying.
How much did you weigh?
I was 17 at that time, and I weighed 64 pounds when I was liberated.
So talk about the liberation now.
Well, then we were liberated, and a small group of soldiers came, I don't know, maybe 30, 50, and they didn't know that there was a concentration camp. They didn't have the slightest idea. And now they found themselves with thousands upon thousands of starving people, tens of thousands of dead bodies, people who were diseased, who were about to flee from the camp and distribute diseases throughout the countryside. And they had to continue fighting because the war was still going on. We were liberated on the 5th of May, and the 7th of May, the war was over. But they were still commanded to move on. So the only food they had were military rations. The little boxes, K rations, had a little can of chopped egg and ham and 3 Chesterfields and a small can opener in it. And that was the stuff that they gave us. They were roughly 2,700 calories in 3 packages. And they gave us the stuff to eat. I ate a can of chewing tobacco. I didn't know what I was eating. No, I couldn't speak English, and as a result of that, maybe 20,000 people died.
What do you mean? As a result of?
Of eating that food, because we got terrible diarrhea, and they had no medications or anything to help.
So it was a shock to the system.
Well, it's like me giving you a bottle of olive oil. Yeah. We had nothing in us.
So round it out and tell us how you ended up in London and then America.
Well, I went to England. I went to Yugoslavia, and I found no parents. I found no friends. And there was severe communism under Marshal Tito. I was for 2 years, I went to a partisan school and practiced and learned the beauties of communism. And from there, I managed to escape to England. And when I came to England, I had no skills. I had no education. My schooling stopped when I was 13. And I couldn't speak English. So I started working as a laborer, then as a machine tool fitter, then as a tool and die maker. I got married. I came to the States. I went to college for 10 years at night, and I have no complaints. I've been married to a most fabulous, incredible woman for 61 years. She unfortunately, she passed on a couple of years ago. She was the love of my life. And life, I have 2 sons. I have 2 delightful daughters-in-law who are much too good for them. And I have 4 grandchildren. Life has been very, very good to me. I really have no complaints. I was lucky. I was really lucky.
Werner Reich. Very good. Good. Okay. If we can have some house lights and microphones, I would very much like to give you an opportunity to ask Werner questions. Right over here.
I saw.
Just 2 weeks ago, we were in Auschwitz with our synagogue. We did a Jewish heritage tour. And the fact that anybody at all survived such inhumanity is shocking. The fact that you survived such an experience is unbelievable. Where did you settle when you came to America, and what did you do to make a living?
She's asking, where in America did you settle, and what did you do for a living, for your work?
I settled in New York because my sister survived the war, and she came to the United States. And I settled in New York, and now I live on Long Island. I worked as an industrial engineer, primarily in the food business, food industry, supermarkets, and warehousing, distribution, and transportation.
Yeah, going through everything that you did, if you could say a word to your 13-year-old self as the SS first came in, what would you tell yourself?
He's asking if you could go back and tell your 13-year-old self some word or piece of advice, what would you say?
Run. I really, you know what, the problem, it's extremely difficult for me. You know, it's, you can give sound advice like hide, but hide where? Who's going to hide you? If I went with the partisans, and many of my friends did, most of them died during the war. They were, instead of in a concentration camp, they died in the forests of Bosnia. So I really, I can't think of anything, you know, even if there was no chance of escaping to other countries. It's probably, if I think for a long time, maybe I'd figure out something, but it's not as easy. Like, for instance, people ask me very often, have you tried to escape from the concentration camp? You know, it sounds great, you know, you see these fabulous movies, you see these ultra-stupid German soldiers, you know, who eat sauerkraut and have funny names. But in reality, to escape from a camp is extremely difficult. Let me just, to give you, first of all, you need proper clothing. We had only striped clothing. We had a tattoo. We had no hair. We couldn't speak the language. We had no maps. We had no money. We had no identification card. I mean, it all sounds very easy and very light. 1,300,000 people have been shipped to Auschwitz. Exactly 2 managed to successfully escape. 2. And they were both Slovak soldiers, resistance movement soldiers, and who were fully trained. So
let's take a couple more questions and then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. First, I want to thank you very much for this very moving presentation you did, and very difficult things and everything that you've gone through, and how you've been able to be here and share this with us. I just had one question. How did you maintain your sense of humor?
How did you maintain your sense of humor?
Humor was an exceedingly important aspect of our lives in Auschwitz and in the concentration camp. The only other conversation that people had, first of all, we had no news what was happening from the outside of the camp, and occasionally people came from other camps and there were some rumors. The main subject of conversation in all the camps was food. And we were starving. We were actually starving. And to talk about food while you're starving makes you only more hungry. And so we had joke sessions, and just about every night we had joke sessions where somebody would tell a joke in Yiddish, and then somebody else would translate it into German, somebody into Polish, somebody into Russian, then somebody would tell a joke in Romanian, and then somebody would translate it into Yiddish, and so on. And so we had joke sessions every day. We had joke sessions in Mauthausen, lying amongst corpses. And it was one thing that kept us going. While we were in Auschwitz, we had a standard saying, "I'm happy that I'm in Auschwitz. If I wouldn't be happy, I'd still be in Auschwitz. Might as well be happy." And I tell you the truth, it's something that I remembered and something that I very much based my life on. If something goes sour, that's it, finished. Accept it and get on from there. It doesn't make any difference if you start beating your head against the wall, if you start crying and hollering and so on. You're just wasting time. You just make yourself more miserable than you were before. Instead, leave it, sweep it up and get on with it. And that's how I maintain my sense of humor, and pretty well many of the other people who were in the camps.
Go ahead. First of all, thank you for sharing your amazing story with us and for being here today. My parents were also Holocaust survivors, and my mother may have actually been in Auschwitz the same time that you were there. And you may have just also answered my question in that, to follow up on all of the things that you said, how do you think you survived when so many did not?
She points out that her parents were Holocaust survivors, and her mother was at Auschwitz at the same time you were. And then she asked, why do you think you survived when so many others did not?
I can give you a long story about my good looks, my sunny disposition, and my God knows what else. Just luck. We are talking about strictly luck, nothing else. And don't let anybody else tell you anything else, because there were thousands of diseases. There were so many opportunities. I could have frozen to death in that open railroad car from Auschwitz to Mauthausen. I could have died from poisoning when my feet were operated. I mean, I could have, what's his name? Somebody could have told a good joke to Mengele while I was running by, and he wouldn't have looked at me. No, it's strictly 100% luck, nothing else, just luck.
While we're getting the microphone to the next person, I want to fill in a couple of the gaps because we won't have to spend time on some of the other questions that in the story. One thing is, and you correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, your sister did survive. You were reunited with her later in the United States. Nivelli, Mr. Levine, the magician, this is the part that as magicians, it's just poetic injustice. Nivelli survived, ended up in New York, less than 30 minutes from where Werner ended up, and they never met. He found out about Nivelli by reading his obituary in the New York Times. So also, Werner, as he mentioned a little bit, he gives, 100 talks per year?
Yes.
100 talks per year. He goes all over advocating for awareness on the Holocaust, but also at dinner last night, I didn't even realize this, when he acts as sort of an intervention when things happen. For example, was it just a few days ago, he was called into a school because some teenagers had spray painted swastikas on, they did $25,000 of damage, and that's a jailable offense, of course, but part of their treatment, part of retribution is they sit down with Werner and Werner tells his story and tries to communicate the problems of their actions. So this is the way he's spreading it and paying it on. So I just wanted to make sure we all understood that before we go on.
One question. Did you ever lose hope? And if not, what kept your hope up?
Did you ever lose hope? And if not, what kept your hope alive? Can we go to him next? The little guy right here. He wanted to ask a question.
Actually, only on one occasion did I lose hope when they announced that a new commander of Auschwitz had been assigned, and his job was to go from camp to camp and liquidate the camp. That's the only time, because if everybody gets killed, there's not a chance of you escaping. But on all other occasions, I was optimistic that nothing is going to happen to me. I was a teenager, and I didn't have responsibilities. It was just a question of life or death, and I knew I'm going to make it. And as you can see, I was right. The only problem with this assumption is that millions thought exactly the same, and they were wrong. And that's where the tragedy of the Holocaust lies.
How did you react to your father's death?
How did you react to your father's death?
My father's death was, I didn't grasp it fully. The only time I really grasped it and was when a couple of days after his death, we went to the cemetery and they lowered the coffin, and I had to shovel earth on the coffin, and I still to this day hear the sound of the earth hitting that coffin, and I can't get it out of my head. And at that point, I realized this was it. This was the end of my relationship to my father, and that there's no chance, no hope of him coming back.
One here.
My name is Carol Lorenz, and I just want to share a little bit of my experience during that time here in the United States of America. My grandparents came here from Poland, names Olszewski and Kraswicka, and I remember I was born in 1936, and so I lived my childhood here in the United States of America while the war was going on. I want to tell you, sir, we did not know. You are correct. We did not know about the concentration camps. I remember my mother taking coats that we owned here in the United States of America and taking the lining out of those coats and putting in things like aspirin and Band-Aids and things of that nature, hoping that they would get to our relatives in Poland. But I want you to know that I'm sure they never, ever did arrive. I'm a Christian. I'm a Catholic. I understand that the Catholic Church, and I'm sorry because I don't practice any longer because of what has recently happened in the church, but I'd like you to know that I think during the war, the Catholic Church tried very hard. and I think successfully at times, to rescue Jewish children. And my granddaughter recently, Blair, married a Jewish young man. And so now I have a Jewish granddaughter by the name of Gwen Ellison. Thank you so much, sir, for being here.
Just telling her story.
How concerned are you about the surge of anti-Semitism, both here and in Europe?
How concerned are you about the surge of anti-Semitism here and in Europe?
I am really not concerned about the surge. The anti-Semitism has been here all the time. It's just now coming to the surface. And that's it. Frankly speaking, I know I sound terrible, but I'm glad that I know where it is and that it exists. It gives me an opportunity to force people to educate and teach more. Because if we live in a world of fantasy and we think it doesn't exist, then we are going to have another Holocaust. And we can...
Okay.
Last question.
Last question.
I'd like to ask about the intervention that you are doing from time to time with schools. What do you feel is the result that you are getting? Are you getting through to these teenagers, or are there some of them that still say, oh, you don't know anything?
She's asking, what is the result of when you do interventions? Are you getting through to the students, or do you think that they just hear your words and then they go out the other side?
Unfortunately, the students realize fully after I talk to them what is going on. I say unfortunately because the schools have never told them that it is illegal to paint swastikas. They gave them absolutely no advice about anti-bias rules and laws and things like that. And that's one thing which I'm trying to institute in New York State. They have, the students are not aware that these things are illegal. They are not aware that if they get arrested and they get a criminal record, they won't be able to get into colleges, they won't be able to get a college loan, and which is even more, the worst is that they will not be able to get a job. 3 out of 4 people with criminal records are unemployed. And the schools are doing absolutely nothing about it. They're teaching them unnecessary junk, but the important things that may regulate their lives, that will make the difference between true life and death, they don't teach them that. And I'm trying to work on this. And it is extremely, extremely important. I don't want people to be hurt because of stupidity. The Holocaust happened basically because of the stupidity of the people who stood by and didn't do anything.
Okay. We're going to wrap it up there. Werner will, of course, be available. If you'd like to see him, I'm going to be doing a tour of the Houdini exhibition outside. You must see it while you're here. It's incredible. But for now, please help me thank someone who I hope you view as I do as a living treasure and reminder. Ladies and gentlemen, Werner Reich.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll go down this way.